learning this?
Well,
Okay, so I'll be much more consistent in English than in Spanish. So the first point I wanted to make is that a ver, perfecto. Is that climate change, environmental issues were not at all central to the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank was created in 1944, and its formal name is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The idea was to rebuild the world after World War II. And so we created in 1944, but it's almost 30 years. Almost 30 years. I'm not very good at PowerPoint and timeline, otherwise you would see a big difference here. But it's almost 30 years before we have the first loan that tackles environmental issues. And that was a pollution loan to Brazil to do some environmental cleanup. So the first 30 years, environment is not really considered an issue. And then in 1985, we have the first suspension of a loan to a country for environmental issues. This was a terrible loan. I was reading about it over the weekend. It was a loan to Brazil in the Amazon, and basically built the road in the middle of the Amazon, led to massive deforestation, as well as to massive contamination of indigenous populations with various diseases and so on and so forth. Absolutely catastrophic loan. And for the first time ever, we suspend a loan saying, no, we cannot be doing more harm than we created. So, and then after that, things start accelerating a little bit. There's much more conscience of these types of issues. A couple of years later, it's also that the world is changing, right? We have the Rio conference, we have Silent Spring, we have these kinds of issues. So for the first time ever in 1987, an environmental department is created, and there's a sense that environment is a development issue, that we need environmental experts. So that's 43 years after the creation of the World Bank, before environment is finally considered as a central part of the development agenda. And then a couple of years later, there's the creation of environmental safeguards. It's environmental and social safeguards. And the idea of these safeguards is to make sure that we have rules around our loans so that they don't create environmental harm. And when there are environmental or social consequences, mitigating measures are taken care so that there is a net positive and it's a responsible investment from a social and environmental point of view. And then in 1993, another really important thing in the history, I think, of the World Bank and these kinds of institutions, the creation of an independent inspection panel that any citizen, any person in any country who feels that there is something wrong from an environmental or social point of view in a World Bank loan can go to this independent panel and request an investigation. I mean, there's all sorts of measures. From my point of view, where I sit today, the last thing I want to hear is that an inspection panel is looking at one of our loans, because then we have to provide all sorts of information, and there is a very thorough investigation that's done. So from my point of view today, it's not enjoyable at all, but from the point of view of transparency and making sure that what the World Bank does is responsible, the World Bank and any government institution affiliated with the World Bank, it's an extremely important, extremely valuable instrument. And then another important thing is in 1994, we adopted disclosure policies. So in the past, when we had a loan, it wasn't necessarily easy for any one of you to find out what we were investing in, where we were investing, what were the terms of the loan, these kinds of things. Today, go on the website. And if I want to keep something confidential, I really have to argue that it is confidential for very good reasons. But the assumption is that everything is disclosed. So but you can see it's been slow. It's been slow in coming, and it's not been smooth. And here in 2002, there was an internal evaluation of the World Bank that concluded that bank management concerned with an ever-growing development agenda has not been consistent in its commitment to the environment. And it says the modest extent of mainstreaming the environment into the bank's overall program is disturbing. Okay, now if I think about my own evolution over time, I grew up in a household. My mother was a militant ecologist in France. She kept getting arrested for sitting in to prevent the construction of nuclear power plants. I grew up in France in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, where there was, in the course of 8 to 10 years, massive construction of nuclear power plants. So I grew up with that. So, and I wanted to be a businesswoman. I wanted to go do, and then I wanted to go save the world. What was important to me was growth, right? And when I went to Columbia, I did my PhD in economics. I'm pretty sure that when I was at Columbia doing my PhD, there wasn't a single environmental economics course, right? And I think I'm fairly representative. It's not that environmental economics didn't exist in the 80s and 90s and so on, but for most of us working in development, the idea was, you grow first and you clean up later, right? And this was true, and it's easy to think that people are evil or corrupt. We were just talking about corruption. My experience of 30 years is that so much more is linked to sheer incompetence. And I would argue that a lot of this was a lack of awareness, a lack of competence, rather than any kind of willful evil behavior, right? At least that's what I hope you think about me personally. And then, of course, comes climate change, right? And the awareness of climate change really comes in the sort of the mid-2000s in, I would say, mainstream economics. And I'll be interested to hear from any of you who have worked in environmental economics over time and come from that field, whether you agree with me. But from my perception was that the climate change really surfaced in mainstream economics around then with the Stern Report and these kinds of things, right? But then when climate change comes to the World Bank at first, it's really about adaptation to climate change, right? And again, it's this idea, developing countries need to grow first, clean up later, but in the meantime, we have to protect them from the impacts of climate change. And then there's a big shift at the World Bank. As Marianne mentioned, there was a decision in, I think, about 2007, 2008, that the World Development Report, which is the flagship publication of the World Bank, and which does set the tone for a lot of its sort of policies afterwards, that it will be about development. It'll be about climate change. And I co-directed that with somebody called Rosina Bierbaum, who's a scientist, because of course I knew nothing about the science of climate change, and it was tough. It was very tough internally. In particular, a number of our shareholders, the World Bank has about 190 shareholders, which are 190 different countries. So my bosses or my board are the ministers of finance of about 190 countries. And there were a number who were not keen on the World Bank working on climate change. In particular, I was summoned to India one day. I had to fly in from a climate change point of view. It was disastrous because I flew in, spent 18 hours in the country and flew back to be told that countries need to grow first and that we cannot impose the views of England and the UK and France and the US, who have destroyed their environment, who have used up their coal resources, to then impose that on the emerging economies. So it was tough, but what we managed to argue there was that it was necessary to act now, it was necessary to act differently, and it was necessary to act together, right? That there was this idea that everybody had a responsibility and things needed to be done, and that climate change was a development issue, that it was difficult to separate. So we managed to push this through and squeeze it out, but that left me, it was interesting because whenever I presented it in developing countries, it was let us grow first and then we'll deal with it, just like the rich countries have done. When I went to present it in Europe, for example, then audiences such as you, young people, would come to me and say, why do you emphasize growth? There's no need for growth, and so on and so forth. But of course, that's an easy thing to say when you're in a rich country. But if you're, what's very clear is that developing countries still need to grow tremendously. So what we then started to push was this idea, well, yes, we need to grow, maybe, but we need a different kind of growth. We need green growth. We need climate smart growth. And so we developed this report there where we argued that greening growth was necessary, which I think we managed to convince people, but also that it was efficient, and that there was plenty in the growth processes today that is highly inefficient, and that could be, if we could fix it with good policies, could enable to continue to grow equally fast or faster, but without necessarily destroying the environment. And that very inefficiency meant that greening growth is affordable, right? And the argument was, maybe we can't get to net zero with pure positive things, with pure win-wins. But let's at least tackle the win-wins first, because there are so many of them, and we see them every time we cross the street, right? They're standing in our face. But then at the time, there was still, within the World Bank, there was this kind of argument, there was a bit of a dominance of the traditional economists who were arguing, okay, no problem, we'll fix climate change, we'll put a price of carbon, problem resolved, right? And what we're arguing, anybody who's really worked on climate change knows that a carbon price or price incentives are useful and are critical, are essential for the efficiency of the process, but will not in and of themselves create the massive shifts and changes that need to happen. And the other thing that was happening at the time, where I don't know if anybody who worked on climate change or maybe some of the younger generation know about these McKinsey cost curves. So Miss McKinsey cost curve, McKinsey, in its infinite wisdom and wonderful packaging, had come up with this sort of the list, a ranking of all the different things you could do to reduce emissions, and ranked them by cost, right? So it looked like a dispatch curve. So first you do the cheapest thing, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a huge problem with that, which is that some of the investments, to be able to do them efficiently and cost effectively, you need to start now. So some of the most expensive measures that you have to take, you need to do now. So to give you an example, urban planning, right? Today, it's almost impossible in a city like Houston that's very spread out to develop a public transportation system, right? Because it's so spread out. So urban planning or these kinds of things are expensive. You might not need them immediately for your emission reduction, but if you don't do it now, you won't be able to do it later. So in here, we were arguing that the timing of things was absolutely essential. And we were also arguing that price incentives were not sufficient and that you really needed to look at all sorts of other measures. And also finally, that the biggest problem with climate change today in the world is not technology, it's not resources, it's fundamentally the political economy, right? Many things that make economic and financial sense today are not done for political economy reasons. So this was the first time we really started talking about political economy. And then another big important report that sort of changed the conversation was a report done by my colleague Stéphane Dalgat, who led this, and basically was saying, look, because one of the arguments we were hearing is, look at what the models are showing you. The impacts on GDP are not very large. At the global level, they're not very large at all. So why should we worry? Should we really worry? And his point was that there's a big difference between the impact on GDP and the impact on well-being, on overall well-being. And that's because the loss of $1, the loss of $20 to somebody like me who has a bank account, who has a fancy house that's not vulnerable to floods and droughts, it's going to be very different than the person who lives in the villa, whose house and whose assets are entirely held in that little house that they have, which is probably going to get flooded and destroyed, right? So this started looking at the impacts of climate change in the development context in a very different way, and not just looking at it from a very narrow impact on GDP. And then finally, this is a publication that Julie led, right? With Julie, somebody who was working with Marianne. And there we merged two different strands of literature. There's a strand of literature about how much countries need to invest, right? And in infrastructure, etc. And these usually throw big numbers around. And these big numbers also are being thrown around in the context of climate change, where you hear these enormous, humongous sums saying, oh, in order to combat climate change or get the infrastructure countries on, you'll have to spend, I don't know how many trillions and trillions of dollars. We were arguing that this is not a helpful conversation. How much countries need to invest depends on what they want to achieve and how efficient they are in getting there. And that's the same thing. If I ask you, how much do I need to buy a house, to build myself a house? What's the answer? It depends, right? It depends. Do I want a big house, small house? Do I want a house in a fancy place? Do I want a house that's very green, etc., etc.? And also, how good am I at building this house? Am I good at negotiating with the various providers? Will I do some of it myself? Is my son going to be able to blah, blah, blah? Okay, it depends. So what this book or this report did was to say, look, let's not throw these numbers around. Let's look carefully at, first of all, let's define some goals. And then we define different goals, right? Different goals, SDGs with climate change, well, SDGs do include climate change, and then plain vanilla. Right? And we said, well, okay, clearly it makes a huge difference whether you want to get, top-notch infrastructure spending, or you want something that is compatible with emission reduction. And also the efficiency, because the efficiency of public spending tends to be very low, particularly in developing countries. Between incompetence and corruption, there's a lot better that could be done, right? And so what we ended up concluding in there is that the amount that would need to be, that countries, we could get the kind of infrastructure that's necessary for net zero at about 4.5% of GDP for developing countries as a whole. This doubles if it's not done efficiently. And by efficiency, the key driver of efficiency is acting in a timely manner, investing in a timely manner. And that's because the biggest cost of not being efficient is in having to retire infrastructure early, retire thermal power plants early. So starting right away and building correctly is going to be one of the big elements. Anyway, I'm droning on a little bit on the history, so let me switch a little bit. So then, these shifts happen gradually over the World Bank, and finally in 2016, the World Bank adopts its first climate change action plan. And that really mainstreams climate change so that it starts becoming part and parcel of everything we do. And the commitment then is to have about a quarter, I believe the commitment was about a quarter of our investments being climate tagged, or helping for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And we can have a discussion of how we measure that, but I'll keep that separately. If you want, we can discuss it afterwards. I think it's still very problematic how we capture that. And then the more recent climate change action plan is even more ambitious. Now it says that 35% of our lending should be related to climate adaptation or mitigation. I think the idea is to have about half and half. And the other thing that it argues there is that all our loans have to be Paris aligned. So, from the Paris Club, the idea that everything we do has to at least help towards climate change, etc. And then also what comes out of these things is the idea of being better informed. And so now every country is in a client country of the World Bank, we're supposed to be doing these country climate development report. And this is what I'll spend the next probably 10 minutes or so talking about. And Marianne co-led, participated in the Argentina one. So any difficult question you can ask her, not me. All right, so what do they examine? So they look at four things. One is what are the climate related opportunities and risk in the country, be they physical or transition risks, so policy related risks. It looks at the institutional framework within a country around climate change and its commitment, right? It's nationally determined contribution, long-term strategies, etc. The third thing is doing a deep dive on some of the sectoral policy that are most relevant to climate change, which can vary a little bit depending on the country. And then finally, the macroeconomic implications of climate change in terms of growth, in terms of fiscal sustainability, in terms of stability of the financial system, but also its implications in terms of poverty. So we've done about 25, last year, 25 of these country climate development reports were published. These are the dark blue ones. And I believe there's another 23 or 24 that have been done that are now being done this year. So we have about, by the next COP, so in the next few months, we should have about 49 or so of these that will cover. Those were, the first batch covered about 34% of the world population. This new batch will cover about half of the world's population. And so what are some of the key findings? Well, the first one is not particularly surprising. It's arguing that climate change is really exacerbating natural disasters and that it poses a threat to long-term development objectives and in particular poverty reduction. And our estimates is that across these developing countries, a potential 12% loss in due to climate changes, due to the impacts of climate change. But this is quite different depending on the income group, right? So the low income, this is losses without adaptation. The low income countries could be between -12 and -7%, so extremely large impacts. The lower middle income countries, by the way, do people know what are these classifications, what they mean? Approximately. So a low-income country typically has about, I think the latest cutoff is about $2,000 at $1,400. I think the low middle income is about $4,000 or $5,000, and the upper middle income must be about $12,000 or $14,000. Right? Argentina is square into upper middle income income status, despite its best effort to move down the scale of these days. So you can see, so the lower middle income losses between -7 and -4, and the upper middle income much more modest, right? And that can be explained by the general vulnerability of these countries. But what's interesting is that in the case of Argentina, what Marianne and colleagues found is that Argentina, without adaptation between droughts and floods, could lose up to about 4.5% of GDP, which puts it squarely into the lower middle income country category. And that's because in the end, Argentina has an economic structure that's somewhat atypical of an upper middle income country, which is obviously which remains much more, remaining much more dependent on agriculture and commodities. Now, as I mentioned before, the idea is that GDP losses can mask much higher impacts on well-being. And for example, we expect the poverty rates in the Sahel to grow by, if again, unmitigated impact, could grow from a baseline of about 27% of the population in poverty to about 34%. So very significant impact, particularly on the more vulnerable countries. And then disproportional impact on women and children, which could have very long-term consequences over time. So, so I think I skipped something. No, okay, here we are. So now, but adaptation can definitely make a significant difference. So here, these were the losses we were looking at before. But we can see that we could really massively reduce the losses through adaptation measures that are highlighted in these reports, and moving it by about 2 to 5%, and in fact managed to get into positive territory in upper middle income countries because so many of these adaptation measures are win-wins. They're good for adaptation, but they're also good for growth and for other measures. Now, one of the findings there confirms some of the things that I was saying earlier, is that it is possible to gain growth without necessarily slowing it down. And if you look at some of the measures that we propose in adaptation and mitigation, there's definitely quite a lot of positive. So the climate for each one of these for each one of these CCDRs, one of the things that was done was to build an emission reduction scenario. But these are bottom up, right? And they depend very much, and they're fairly realistic, so they depend very much on the country's context. And so what the scenarios cumulatively across those 25 countries comes to is a 70% emission reduction across the first batch, which is obviously not sufficient to get to net zero. And most of that reduction happens in upper middle income countries. So you see Argentina, Kazakhstan, China. Obviously, China is a big driver of the 70%, right? It's the giant in the room, the elephant in the room. But if you look at lower middle income countries, it's much more varied. For some of them, we just couldn't come up with a good emission reduction scenario. And for the low income countries, we didn't build these emission scenarios because for the most part, their emissions are extremely low, and their priority is really on the adaptation side. Now, as I said, it's not sufficient to get to net zero. The scenario has us going from about 21 to about 5 gigaton of CO2 equivalent over time. But the impact of reverse climate action, which is not negligible, itself is fairly positive, right? So in terms of GDP impact, you see the impacts could be sort of a fairly small reduction to a fairly substantial net increase, particularly in the lower and upper middle income countries. But again, you see this big difference between the impact on GDP and the impact on well-being, right? Where we see that particularly in the low income and lower middle income countries, there could be fairly significant losses in consumption. And where does that come from? It comes from the trade-off between investments and consumption. In order to get here, you need to put a lot more resources in investments, which can detract, at least in the first period, from household consumption. So what will it take, right? Well, it requires a lot of policy reforms and the reallocation of scarce public resources, right? That's for sure. But it also requires mobilization of private capital. But private capital will only come if the incentives are lined up, and that again requires governmental action in terms of regulations and incentives. It also requires complementary measures to ensure a just transition. And here I'd like to make a small parenthesis on this idea of a just transition and the idea of when we look at the redistributive impacts of climate policies, right? So most often when we talk about the just transition, we're talking about compensating the poor. But I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the history of fossil attempts across the world at removing fossil fuel subsidies. In the vast majority of countries, and there's some very interesting analysis of the 30, 40, or 50 episodes of attempts at removing fossil fuel subsidies across the world. And in the vast majority of the cases, they fail. And they fail because people go into the street and protest and so on and so forth. But the people going into the street and protest are not the poorest. Now, removing fossil fuel subsidies will hurt the poor most, even when they're not the ones who are driving big cars, etc. But typically, it affects the price of food, and even a small increment in the price of food will affect the well-being of a poor person who spends a disproportionate amount of their budget on food. But so the point here is that the protests, the ones who will block the reform, is often not the poorest, right? It's the middle class, or if you think of, for example, what we've learned from trade reform, it tends to be the powerful, the connected, etc., who would lose their privilege, right? So, in fact, some of the analysis we've done of the political economy of climate change draws from the political economy of trade reform, because trade reform is also the kind of reforms where you have concentrated losses, right? A few small groups tend to lose, and very diffuse gains that are spread over the time. So people don't go and protest in the street in order to get those gains that will be very diffuse over time, but the few lobbyists or the few people that can choose will protest. So the idea here is that when we talk about the just transition, of course, we have to be careful about the poor and so on and so forth. But if we want to have a successful transition, we also have to think about anybody who stands to lose and think about how to buy them off, right? And one of our colleagues at the World Bank is just now finishing a interesting analysis of the political economy of climate change, which will be out, I think, next month, that really tries to take political science and apply it to climate change policy reforms. And that I think really emphasizes this particular point, that, yeah, of course you want to protect the poor, but you've got to buy off the powerful. And so on and so forth. Anyway, and then finally, absolutely essential support from the international community, because the investments needed are large. Now, these investments are not so large for the upper middle income countries, right? Because essentially they tend to have already a lot of the infrastructure. It's much more, what's needed is much more of the policy reforms to ensure that the private sector has the right incentives. This is quite different when you start getting to lower middle income countries, in part because they need a lot more investment. They still need some of the basic infrastructure investments, but also because some of them tend to be much more vulnerable. And then you have some really interesting issue of structural issue when you look at countries like South Africa, which is a huge coal producer, or Iraq, which is an oil producer, where you have some substantial reforms that need to happen. Where the investment needs are huge in proportion of GDP, but absolutely not in absolute amounts, right? Because 8 or 10% of low-income country GDP is not a very large sum, things considered, but it's a completely disproportionate share of their own income is in the low-income countries, because they're so vulnerable, because they have so little structure, and so on and so forth. So just to conclude, not a very surprising conclusion, but essentially, you know, the reports really confirm this idea that the successful transition requires a combination of policy reform and investment in our country, but that the relative proportion of these things can vary depending on the level of income. So my last slide, what do we do with these reports, right? We're very good at publishing reports, and we're very good at producing reports. We're less good at publishing them and making them easily accessible and readable. But then what do we do with them? Because many of them do unfortunately sit on shelves. So the idea of the role of these reports is really three things. One is to inform our World Bank group country engagement. So, you know, in Argentina, in Paraguay, we're working on these things. The idea is to really use them to decide, okay, what do we want to work with the government on? Where are we going to try to push the government? Where are we going to privilege our resources? Then to support the governments in the development of their national determined contribution, long-term strategies, so on and so forth. And then finally, to help more generally our client countries, but also our development partners, integrate climate and development. So, for example, the IMF, Paraguay, which is one of the countries under my responsibility, is talking to the IMF about tapping into its it's got this big trust fund in order to be able to work on some of this climate change work. So the IMF and ourselves are working together because obviously the IMF doesn't have a lot of comparative, not a lot of expertise in climate issues. And so they're using a lot of these country climate development reports for that. So then me and Pierre have probably spoken more than I was supposed to, but I'm open for questions and comments. Thank you.
¿Podemos hacer las preguntas en...?
Sí, no, podemos pasar al español ahora.
¿Y alguien quiere...? ¿Marcelo?
Español.
¿Cómo quieres?
Perfecto.
Bueno, muy buena la charla. Tengo un comentario y una pregunta.
Sí.
El comentario es menor. Tanto el BID está diciendo algo parecido a lo que dijo usted, que es que los precios al carbono no sirven. Y el comentario es, no es que no sirvan, sino que tiene el mismo problema que el resto. Que lo que usted dijo, que está bien. Entonces, ese es el comentario menor. La otra es una pregunta que es, ¿cuánto sale de reports de política de economía?
Ah.
¿Cómo se puede, quién lo escribe, cómo lo consigo?
Ok, bueno, te voy a dar la última. Lo más fácil puede ser que a través de Mariana o a través de mí, me imagino que si lo quieres de forma urgente, porque la publicación a veces demora un poquitito, pero lo están finalizando, no sé si lo quieren sacar para la COP, pero será en los próximos meses y puede ser que si lo quieres ahora podemos ver con ese autor si te pueden mandar el PDF. Es muy bueno, a mí me pareció muy bueno. ¿Tú lo has recibido, Mariana, o todavía? Sí. Bueno.
Vos me lo mandaste.
Ah, bueno. Entonces sí. Lo del precio del carbón no me sorprende que el BID dice lo mismo porque el intellectual lead en el BID, que es Adrián Borger, lo recluté y participé en todos esos informes, así que tenemos todos la misma visión, digamos. Sí, sí, sí. Él fue parte del primer grupo de economistas que recluté que sabían realmente de cambio climático. No pienso que es bueno decir que el precio del carbono no sirve. Son esencial para la eficiencia, pero estoy totalmente de acuerdo que la economía política es complicada. Ahora estamos terminando un trabajito sobre Uruguay, donde estamos estimando el precio total al carbono, porque Uruguay dice que tiene un precio un carbon tax alto.
Soy de Uruguay.
Ah, bueno.
Uruguay fue uno de los que lo hizo.
El informe, ahí trabajaste bueno, es muy interesante este trabajo. Básicamente, bueno, este trabajo lo que hace es decir, bueno, oficialmente es un precio al carbono muy alto, pero si ves todas las exenciones al VAT y todo eso, al final el precio al carbono total o el carbon tax real es muy, muy bajo. Y no sé cómo tu país le va a gustar cuando le decimos eso, porque Uruguay en general se presenta como un país que es haciendo bastantes esfuerzos. Sí, por favor.
Sí, hola, sí la acabamos de buscar cuáles son las prioridades de inversión para la producción y para la inversión para los países de la Argentina, Uruguay, y la idea es privada para sectores de irrigación, de universidades, o ir más bien a hacer inversión en cultura pública, con pues el orden de prioridad donde la inversión de.
Bueno, Mariana me va a ayudar a responder sobre el tema sobre el caso argentino porque lo conoce muy bien. Pero yo diría, bueno, para países como Uruguay y Argentina, para mí realmente lo más importante en los próximos años son todas esas inversiones en adaptación al mínimo, en irrigación y no solamente irrigación, pero water storage, ese tipo de cosas, ¿no? Pienso que eso es esencial. Y otro tema, bueno, Mariana te va a dar los detalles de inversión como en hard stuff, pero una cosa que a mí me preocupa bastante y donde me parece que dentro del Banco Mundial no lo tenemos suficientemente claro es todo el sistema de protección social. De tener un sistema de protección social que sea easily scalable and rapidly scalable a un costo que no sea prohibitivo. una cosa que vimos durante la pandemia, que en Argentina, por ejemplo, se puede sacar un bono rápido, pero como no, Argentina no tiene buenos datos sobre quién son los vulnerables, quién son los pobres, quién vive con quién, al final todo el sistema de protección social que sea scalable es muy costoso. Y eso es una de las cosas que me preocupa mucho. Pero Mariana, ¿quieres dar una idea?
No, bueno, en el CCDR de Argentina, lo que una de las principales conclusiones es que la inversión en cuestiones relacionadas al agua, porque como al ser el impacto más grande sobre de las sequías y las inundaciones, lo que vimos es que inversiones en agua no solamente aumentan la resiliencia, sino que tienen un impacto positivo sobre el PBI. En un estilo de los trabajos que hacemos, lo que vimos es que más o menos podría aumentar el PIB 2,7% anual por una serie de inversiones como agua y saneamiento, aumentar el stock de agua, soluciones basadas en la naturaleza. Entonces, un poco esa es la idea. Es el y puede estar combinada mayoritariamente pública, pero siempre los informes del CCDR, lo que es la idea es que toda la inversión privada que pueda hacerse es bueno fomentarla, digamos. No es solamente la inversión pública, sino también la comunicación.
Elisa.
Elisa Belfiore. Quería saber, o sea, está muy arraigado, un poco ando en la región con los policymakers, esta idea de nosotros no somos los responsables históricos, como decías, y nosotros todavía necesitamos desarrollarnos, y de a poco se va hablando, bueno, desarrollemos, ¿no?, en esta agenda de Green Growth. Pero me parece que aún sigue como la región atascada en nosotros tenemos otros problemas, ¿no? Y quería saber un poco, vos que hablas con mucha gente en policy, digamos, ¿dónde pensás que está esa discusión, digamos, o la voluntad política, o si hay esta visión de decir, bueno, quizá hay una oportunidad de crecimiento que no estamos viendo porque estamos empacados en nosotros no somos responsables, o cómo ves destrabar eso, o si se está destrabando, no sé, cómo ves el estado de situación, porque he visto años así, venimos con esa cosa.
Bueno, yo diría que una cosa que me ha sorprendido mucho llegando a Argentina este año, que yo no había trabajado acá en más de 10 años, ¿no? Y cuando vine con el World Development Report para hacer una charla sobre cambio climático, no existía cambio climático acá, no había ningún interés. Y hoy en día sí hay mucho, bueno, ha cambiado, a veces vale la pena mirar de dónde venimos, ¿no? Porque obviamente tenemos todavía un camino que hacer, pero si ves dónde un país como Argentina, dónde está hoy en comparación a hace 10 años, es night and day, ¿no? Ha cambiado completamente. Así que quiero hacer ese punto, ¿no? Segundo, lo que es interesante en la región es que al final, especialmente en Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, que son países exportadores de commodities, que al final el cambio, se dan cuenta que mucho de lo que hay que hacer son win-wins, ¿no? Por todas esas inversiones, por ejemplo, que existen ahí en adaptación, que pueden también tener muchos impactos en términos de mitigación. Entonces, eso ayuda un poquito. El argumento que todavía no me parece que sea tan contundente es esa idea del transition risk, ¿no? De que eventualmente puede ser que las exportaciones argentinas podrían ser afectadas si no son, si la agricultura, si todo eso no se ha hecho con deforestation free, ese tipo de cosas. Eso, con la excepción de Uruguay, no veo que sea todavía tan contundente. Pero la ventaja, en términos de energía, bueno, Uruguay y Paraguay son países con matrices energéticas bastante limpias. Y acá en Argentina me parece que hay una conciencia creciente del hecho de que it makes business sense, ¿no? De tener más energía renovable, que hay un potencial extraordinario acá. Y entonces no escucho tanto de esa idea de que no queremos, bueno, queremos seguir con energías sucias y deforestación. Es más la idea de que, bueno, otra vez incompetencia, corrupción, no sé exactamente, pero cosas no están moviéndose suficientemente rápido, pero no tanto porque se escucha que primero queremos solamente enfocarnos en un crecimiento sucio y después lo empeoramos después, ¿no? Pienso que eso es muy diferente de un país como Sudáfrica o Irak o países que sí tienen una ventaja comparativa en un modelo de crecimiento totalmente diferente. No sé si eso responde a tu...
Sí, perfecto. Sí, en realidad la respuesta es un poco también, seguimos sin crecer por las mismas razones que tampoco crecimos antes, digamos, ¿no? O sea que no crecimos ni sucio ni vamos a crecer verde, ni me parece.
Totalmente, dijiste mucho mejor que yo. Sí.
Yo tengo una pregunta relacionada con esto. Se habla mucho, sobre todo en Argentina, del uso del gas natural como combustible de transición, ¿no? Y también empiezo a escuchar de economistas muy buenos como Acemoglu diciendo esa transición en realidad, al menos para la economía de Estados Unidos, está afectando o va a afectar al desarrollo de la tecnología renovables. ¿Cuál es tu opinión sobre un recurso que para Argentina parece muy, digamos, casi limitado, y cómo afecta eso a lo que vos decís? Bueno, la idea esta de, bueno, queremos también invertir en combustibles, digamos, en fuentes de energía renovable, ¿no? ¿Afecta o no la adopción de la tecnología? ¿Lo va a retrasar todo ese proceso?
Bueno, Mariana, ¿quieres?
Y mira, nosotros en el CIGIR de Argentina decimos exactamente eso, que el tema es que hay dos temas. Uno, que el banco tiene como premisa que no financia gas natural, salvo que sea una emergencia o que no haya energía alternativa. Eso no es el caso de Argentina. Esa es la primera cosa que decimos, ¿no? Y la segunda cosa que decimos es justamente lo que vos decís, que por ahí si vos pasás a gas pensando que eso es una solución definitiva, retrasás renovables. Por ejemplo, si vos pensás, una de las ideas muchas veces es pasar el transporte público a gas, hacerle, poner en los techos tanques de gas con la idea de que tenés gas. Y bueno, eso sí que claramente va a retrasar la electrificación, que puede ser hecha con fuentes renovables, y es un riesgo. Nosotros decimos en Argentina que hicimos un modelo que lo que muestra es que si la decarbonización mundial es muy rápida y baja la demanda y por ende los precios del gas natural, en un momento puede haber activos varados, y que eso es un riesgo que Argentina tiene que contemplar. Entonces, bueno, eso sería la perspectiva del banco de la cuestión. No sé si Mariana querés variantes.
Sí, no, quería también hablar del tema del litio del cobre, ¿no? Pasé casi las últimas 2 semanas en Salta, Jujuy, Catamarca, en la Puna, tratando de entender un poquito más la situación con eso. Y ahí claramente Argentina tiene una ventaja comparativa fenomenal para litio, cobre, tierras raras, y muchos de esos insumos que son esenciales para la transición verde. Y eso es fantástico. Además, hay una idea de que Argentina no quiere seguir exportando materia primaria, queremos ahí fabricar baterías, etcétera. Bueno, pero lo que hay que entender es que la producción de litio, tal como se está haciendo acá en Argentina, es una producción bastante sofisticada, que agrega un montón de valor agregado, que es pues, el producto de una industria química súper sofisticada. que el litio que sale de Argentina o que está empezando a salir de Argentina es un litio de 96% de pureza que se puede usar directamente en las baterías. Pero después las baterías son solamente 2 a 4% del valor de la batería viene del litio y se necesita un montón de know-how y un montón de otros insumos para eso. Entonces, si Argentina puede producir esas materias que son en el value chain, no son tan bajos, no son tan simples. Entonces eso me parece muy positivo, pero al mismo tiempo hay toda esa pregunta de cómo hacer una minería sostenible, ¿no? Y ahí en la puna lo que veo es que faltan rutas, por ejemplo, que permitiría transporte, falta el desarrollo del sistema de tren, que permitiría bajar la carbon footprint. Y bueno, hay mucho que hacer, que entender cuál va a ser el impacto sobre los recursos en agua y todo el impacto del medio ambiente de esas industrias. Entonces, para mí eso es donde Argentina hoy en día tiene un potencial muy grande de hacer las cosas o muy bien o muy mal. Y si no lo hace bien, la licencia social de operación en la puna se va a cerrar, igual como se está cerrando en el Perú, y toda esa idea del oro blanco, del futuro grandiosa de la Argentina se va a acabar. Entonces, para mí eso es una de las grandes preocupaciones hoy en día de la transición verde de Argentina, y no estoy segura que hay alguien en el gobierno, que sea hoy o mañana o el de que empezará en diciembre, que tenga realmente la conciencia de que el país va a tener que invertir realmente para que sea un potencial crecimiento el que podía ser.
¿Otra pregunta? ¿Sí?
No, quería preguntar cómo en esta transición puede ayudar, mientras tanto, la eficiencia energética, por ejemplo, el uso poder, la minería urbana, la economía, digamos, circular, si realmente son significativos, mientras tanto, en ese proceso, o es algo muy menor.
Eso depende mucho de los países, ¿no? Obviamente,
Sí,
pero
sobre todo la Argentina, que es
sí,
complicado.
bueno, Mariana, en Argentina
Y en Argentina, sí, vimos también en el Citircal, y de hecho Priscila y su equipo en la UBA estuvieron participando de hacer unas evaluaciones de cómo medidas de eficiencia energética hacia no solo el cambio de emisiones, sino de actividad y empleo. Vimos que también ahí hay potencial, porque hay varias medidas que hacen un triple win-win. Así que sí, la eficiencia es algo importante y que también está relacionado con los precios, ¿no? Si los precios son muy bajos, los incentivos son bajos. Entonces, en la medida en que los subsidios se recorten, vas a tener más incentivos.
Pero eso seguramente va a ocurrir.
Exacto. Así que eso podés mirar y subsidiar y va a ser.
y justamente una de nuestras más recientes operaciones y préstamos para el gobierno es sobre el tema de eficiencia energética.
¿Ann?
Sí, muy interesante la presentación. Quería preguntar en qué medida la política del Banco toman en cuenta al diseñar las acciones para prevenir el cambio climático y para lograr mayor resiliencia, tomen en cuenta la necesidad de alinear las acciones con el nivel de desarrollo y el contexto local, ¿no? Si puede haber un sesgo a favor de grandes inversiones, ¿no? que bueno, me surge un poco esta pregunta por analizar las inversiones del Banco Mundial en los de transporte y tratamiento de cloacal en la provincia de Buenos Aires, en la cuenca Matanzas-Riachuelo en particular, donde se han invertido más de $1.000 millones de dólares en ese sistema y logrando relativamente poco aumento en el acceso a cloaca de los hogares. Y me pregunto si hay, bueno, existen otras formas como land-based systems de tratamiento local y si no convendría considerar otras alternativas. Así que me surge la pregunta por el tema de cambio climático y si esto es un tema que tratan estos informes.
Históricamente, bueno, si regresas a nuestra historia en 1944, teníamos un sesgo bastante grande en favor de hard infrastructure, ¿no? Y de grandes proyectos y todo eso. Yo diría que en los últimos 10 años ha cambiado un montón eso y que ahora hay mucha atención que se está prestando a las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza. Me parece que hace 5 o 6 años el banco publicó un informe sobre este tema de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza o green infrastructure. Y hoy en día es algo que se está considerando bastante por varias razones. Una es porque muchas veces son mucho menos costosos, aún si son muchas veces más complicados, ¿no? Porque es mucho más fácil construir ¿cómo se llama? Un water treatment plant que de negociar con toda una comunidad para que un lugar sea reservado, para que no, bueno, y que eso dura a través del tiempo, ¿no? Pero hoy en día mi impresión es que realmente cuando el Banco Mundial analiza las opciones de soluciones a cualquier tema que sea relacionado a la infraestructura, las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza son muy importantes, en parte no solo porque son muchas veces menos caras, pero también que muchas veces tienen muchas ventajas en términos de resiliencia. Entonces, en el caso específico de Matanzas-Riachuelo, no sé si técnicamente hubiera podido ser una solución. En zonas urbanas suele ser más difícil, no tengo el conocimiento técnico para poder decir, pero sí, solución basada en la naturaleza hoy en día son totalmente parte del arsenal del Banco Mundial.
Bueno, un aplauso.